Previously, I talked about how deontological or duty-based ethics focuses on the motivation behind an act when assessing the moral value of the act. Imagine a terrorist running toward a crowd with a grenade in his hand. A police officer shoots the terrorist, thus stopping the attack. Unfortunately, one of the bullets he fired hit an innocent bystander, killing that person as well. Was that an acceptable outcome of the shooting? Was the shooting justified? Now, what if it turns out that, in fact, the terrorist was just some social media influencer doing a stupid stunt, trying to create a viral video or something equally stupid? The grenade in their hand was just a movie prop. Did your assessment change? The intention of the police officer was to prevent what seemed like a terrorist attack. So, if you go with the deontological view, you will probably not blame them. But now 2 people are dead as a result. Perhaps the police officer is still in the clear, ethically speaking. Certainly the influencer is to blame, but why exactly? What if nobody had been killed? Would that have made a difference? Take another scenario. You eat at a cafeteria, at work or school, for example, where you carry your food to the table on a tray. You pick a table where other people are already sitting down, and as you are trying to set your tray on the table to join them, you somehow fumble and drop your tray, your food and drink spilling over the other people, their plates, perhaps papers on the table. At least some of the people will get stains on their clothes. Perhaps some papers or books also got hit. Now, none of these unfortunate consequences were intentional. You didn't mean to cause them, but they did happen. If you stick to the deontological view, you should feel no guilt. But is that really how you feel? Perhaps, despite your lack of bad intentions, you are responsible for the consequences, at least to some degree. That is the intuition behind consequentialist ethics. This video, which is part of my series Introduction to Ethics, is about consequentialist ethics, especially utilitarian ethics. I will first explain the theory and then discuss some challenges to it. But before getting deeper into that, I would like to ask you to subscribe to my channel and click the thumbs up button. Consequentialist ethics is sometimes called teleological ethics from the Greek word telos, meaning purpose or end, because it's focused on the consequences, the end result of the act being assessed. That may lead to a confusion because virtue ethics can also be called teleological, yet in virtue ethics the telos is not the end result of any specific act, but the kind of person you become by performing certain types of acts, and the kind of life you will end up having as a result. I will discuss virtue ethics in a separate video, and will talk only about the other kind of consequentialist ethics here. There are different types of consequentialist theories like ethical egoism and altruism, but the most famous of them is Utilitarianism. They are all based on the idea that the moral value of an act depends on the consequences of the act. The egoists look at the consequences to themselves, the altruists at the consequences to others, and utilitarians can be thought of as a compromise in the middle of the two, looking at the consequences to everyone. In what follows, I will focus on explaining utilitarian ethics and the problems utilitarianism has to solve, but any consequentialist ethics really has to deal with similar issues. The utility or usefulness that utilitarianism is based on is, generally speaking, happiness. The idea is that everyone wants to be happy, and the purpose of ethics is to help us achieve that. So, Ethics has to be useful and help us choose useful actions that lead to increased happiness. Utilitarianism accepts that what is good is increasing happiness or pleasure, and what is bad is what decreases them. It is thus a form of hedonism. Classical utilitarianism, the theory that for the first time was called utilitarianism by Jeremy Bentham, was based on a very simple idea that follows from the hedonistic idea. Bentham thought that it would be possible to create a felicific calculus, also known as a hedonic or hedonistic calculus. It could then be used to simply calculate the goodness of an act. His motivation was the terrible legal system in the UK at the time, called common law. It gave a lot of free rein to the judges and in fact made it impossible to predict how a court case would go. Bentham presented his calculus as an ideal way in which matters should be judged. He was aware that it would be too impractical to actually ever be perfectly followed, but it would be at least an improvement on the current situation. Bentham included several factors in his calculus that could be used to assess the overall value of the act in question. They are about the pain and pleasure resulting from the act. Unfortunately, he didn't have a unit for the amount of pleasure and pain, but the idea is that each of those factors can be given numerical values, and then they can be calculated to yield the end result that theoretically settles the matter. The factors he included were the intensity of the pain or pleasure, its duration, and even the certainty or uncertainty that the pleasure or pain will result from a hypothetical act. He also included the propinquity or remoteness of the pleasure or pain, meaning how soon the effect will be experienced or for how long one must wait for it. He accounted for the possibility that the experience could be repeated, the chance of which he called fecundity. Because it is possible that an act will be followed by both pleasure and pain, he included the factor of purity. At the most pure, there is no mixing of the opposite sensations. It was very important to consider the number of persons affected, which is what the factor of extent was for. John Stuart Mill accepted most of Bentham's ideas about utilitarianism, but disagreed with his opinion that all pleasures and pains are to be treated equally. Mill saw that some pleasures, mostly the aesthetic and intellectual sort, are of a higher kind than the mere pleasures of the flesh. His most quoted line makes the point. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. The higher pleasures are more valuable, and the difference needs to be accounted for, according to Mill. Both Bentham and Mill were political liberals, meaning they had liberal values influencing their political views, which is very different from what economic liberalism means. Mill's views especially are sometimes labeled liberal utilitarianism. That is because he, along with his wife Harriet Taylor, were prominent proponents of women's right to vote and women's rights in general. Utilitarianism was to be used as a guide for politics. Based on utilitarian principles, everyone should be treated equally, and society should allow free speech and the liberty for everyone to actualize their highest potential as an individual. The laws of any society, just like the acts of individual people, should be based on the principle of utility. They should promote the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. As I have previously mentioned, This means that utilitarian ethics motivates people to actively do good, to change society for the better, which is perhaps the most compelling selling point for the theory, as far as I'm concerned. The principle of utility also, of course, explains why you should avoid doing unethical things. If you consider lying, for example, you may realize that it is good for you as an individual to be known as an honest person, and so it may be a bad idea for you to lie. You might get caught in the lie after all, and that would ruin your reputation. Similarly, a society that does not respect truth will suffer because it is difficult for the members of that society to trust anyone. In fact, that seems to be a huge problem globally right now, because many people have lost their trust in institutions like politics, journalism, and even science. Instead, many of them seek a peace of mind and simple explanations in various conspiracy theories. It is clear that we have to do something to repair the damage done to public trust. We have to hold politicians accountable for their lies. We have to support high-quality journalism and fight bad journalism, at the very least by boycotting untrustworthy sources, but preferably also by taking active action against those who spread lies. We have to teach people about scientific skepticism to combat fake news, hoaxes, pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, and other lies. Which is what I am trying to do here as well. Because it is not obvious how choices should be made, even if we are trying to apply the principle of utility, there are many different versions of utilitarianism. Act utilitarians want to assess each act individually. That seems very difficult to do in practice. It would certainly be time-consuming. This type of ethics is also called situation or situational ethics. It is based on the acceptance of the uniqueness of each situation and an attempt to allow for those situational factors to matter in the decision-making. Rule utilitarians think it is best to consider types of acts instead, calculating the usefulness of a rule and then following it afterwards, if it seems good enough. This thinking is closer to deontological or duty-based ethics, but the difference is that instead of appealing to simple moral truths, rule utilitarians think that the choice of rule is to be based on how beneficial the rule is going to be. There are different versions depending on the exact method for choosing the rule, but you get the basic idea. There are even different views among utilitarians about exactly what counts as the utility or usefulness that should be strived for. The classical view is that of hedonism, but pleasure and pain, even accounting for different qualities of them, might not be enough. Something that, especially at societal level, what needs to be improved is the general welfare of people. It has also been proposed by preference utilitarians that it is impossible for someone else to decide what is good for an individual, so what really should be maximized is the actualization of the preferences of individual people. There are also forms of pluralistic utilitarianism that combine aspects of the different types of utilitarianism. A major issue for utilitarianism is the choice of which consequences to assess. For example, do you differentiate between intended and actual consequences, direct and indirect consequences, immediate consequences, and those more distant in time and/or space? When deciding what to do, you must be aware that your act will have not only the obvious consequences that you can know of in advance, but it may also have some unknown consequences. The consequences may also be of different kinds, so that you may have to consider consequences that are economic, political, individual, religious, physical, and many other types. For example, besides the consequences to humans, how are you supposed to account for the consequences to other animals? How about the environment more generally? The problem is deciding how to weigh the consequences of different categories against each other. Whether you are trying to decide on a course of action or assessing the moral value of some act already committed, you should perhaps consider counterfactual as well as factual consequences. That is, what would have occurred if a different choice had been chosen or nothing had been done. The problem with counterfactuals, despite how much we like to use them when thinking about historical events, for example, is that it is highly questionable what we can really know about them. They are, after all, not facts, only imagined possibilities. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't consider them, especially if you are about to make an important decision. I will present just one more way in which a utilitarian might think. R.M. Hare conceived a thought experiment about the point of view of an archangel. This fictional being has a perfect knowledge of the laws of nature, what the world is like, and even of all the individual preferences everyone has. The angel considers the moral sentiments of all people as equal in value, and uses the knowledge it has to choose actions that are maximally good for the maximal number of people. The idea is that we should try to adopt the archangel's point of view when making ethical choices, because to be ethical, this kind of universalism is required, according to Hare. The thought experiment is meant to help us see things from a wide perspective, but of course, you will never have the archangel's knowledge, so you can only do your personal best. Whichever form of utilitarianism or consequentialism in general we look into, we will of course find problems. There may be solutions for some or even all of them, but it is still useful to think about the counter-arguments. For one, it teaches philosophical argumentation, and for another, it shows what needs to be accounted for in an ethical theory. For example, one may ask, why create ethical rules at all, as rule utilitarians wish to do, if those rules are not always to be followed in the end? The same question could be asked of deontological systems as well, of course. And the answer might be similar in both cases. Having rules or guidelines, even if they are not meant to be dogmatically followed at all times and in all situations, can make life easier. There will always have to be exceptions for things like situations where you are forced to act against your ethics. Perhaps you are helping persecuted minorities by hiding them in your attic, so you are forced to lie to the police looking for the people you are trying to protect. The conflicts between different norms as well as values need to be resolved in some way, and that will never be an easy task, regardless of the ethical theory you are using. The general problem with the classical utilitarian idea that the amount of pleasure caused decides the moral value of an act is that it can pit the suffering of an individual against the pleasure of the many. If the audience greatly enjoys the torture and execution of an individual, does it mean that the greatest good has been achieved? Or might it be morally more important to avoid causing harm and thus to minimize suffering rather than maximize pleasure? The healthcare system includes a lot of prioritizing that is very utilitarian in nature. For example, if you come to a scene of an accident and call the emergency services, 911 in the US, 112 in the EU, you are instructed to assess the condition of the people involved, and instead of helping the loudest of them, see if any are unconscious or nearly so. They may be the ones in most urgent need of help. When patients are treated at the hospital, assessments have to be made about how much the quality of the patient's life is likely to be improved. For example, old people may not be surgically operated on because the risk of complications and problems with recovering from the surgery outweigh the foreseeable benefits of the operation. Resources are always limited, so choices have to be made also about not treating some patients, or at least not using public funds for it, because the treatment of one person can be so costly that the treatment or even daily care of others cannot be afforded. There are many such difficult issues in healthcare, and many of them are fundamentally political, while some are about the decisions an individual healthcare professional has to make as part of their daily routine. Some critics of utilitarianism have used a thought experiment involving patients in a hospital in an imaginative way, as is common to philosophical thought experiments. We are meant to accept that a surgeon at the hospital comes to realize that she has a number of patients, let's say 5, in need of an organ transplant. They all happen to have, by some amazing stroke of luck, the same blood type, and further, there happens to be a young student also as a patient at the hospital, who also has the same blood type. The student is not severely ill and would seem to make a great organ donor for the 5 seriously ill patients. Unfortunately, the student would not survive donating 5 major organs, but without donors, the other 5 patients are about to perish. The question is now posed: would not pleasure be maximized by using the student's organs, even though that would require murder? It would mean taking 1 life to save 5. The math seems simple enough, but it is presumed to feel wrong regardless. There can be several ways of answering the question, even without going into the unlikelihood of the situation, how organ donation actually works, and so on. For example, you could start by thinking about the consequences murdering 1 patient would likely have for the public's trust in the healthcare system. Even if it could be covered up, certainly a similar choice could not be made repeatedly without the activity becoming revealed at some point. Would that lead to people avoiding hospitals and distrusting all medical professionals afterwards? It might even lead to widespread violence against them. Another argument against utilitarianism seems to point out what may seem counterintuitive. In general, stealing is considered wrong, but according to utilitarianism, it is only wrong if it causes displeasure, suffering, or harm of some other kind. But what if you find a way to steal something so that no one will ever even know about it? They cannot experience anything negative then, while you may experience considerable pleasure in gaining whatever it is you stole. It could be money from a huge bank, for example. Perhaps you could pull off some kind of digital theft in such a manner that it will never be noticed. The moral intuition of most people would probably be that it is still theft and, as such, it is wrong. It may be difficult to provide a utilitarian response for this. If you think you can do it, let me know in the comments below. One argument against the core of utilitarianism uses a thought experiment that involves a fictional pleasure machine. Imagine there's a machine that can be used to induce sensations of endless pleasure, with the occasional slight displeasure if required, and all you have to do is lie in the bed of the machine. The machine would keep you alive for your normal lifetime, allowing you to experience practically constant pleasure. You would never have to do anything, and in fact, once in the machine, you wouldn't ever even want to get out of it. a bit like being in a very nice version of The Matrix. Would you lie on that bed, or would you rather choose an ordinary life with all the pain, suffering, heartache and loss that comes with it? Again, let me know in the comments below. A more societal approach is used in arguments about the treatment of minorities and preemptive incarceration. It might be argued that it is good for the population to experience feelings of security. If so, it might be possible to incarcerate minorities or to force them to live segregated from the majority, so that the members of the majority would not be exposed to these minorities that may make them feel insecure. I would expect few people to accept this, but the point is, how would you argue against it from a utilitarian point of view? The argument about preemptive incarceration is similar, but instead of minorities, it is just about arresting people who are considered likely to become threats to society, even if just by committing ordinary crimes. The movie Minority Report has this as a premise. The idea is that, like in the movie, it might be possible to know with fairly good certainty who will commit some actually harmful crime in the near future, like armed robbery, rape, some other violent crime, or whatever. The problem is that at this point the crime has not yet been committed. From a utilitarian point of view, wouldn't it make sense to prevent it from ever happening? Just arrest and imprison the suspect preemptively. A lot of people feel that it would not be justified to imprison a person before they have even committed the crime. Lastly, I'll just mention that there is a movement inspired by utilitarianism called effective altruism. As they say on their website, effective altruism is a research field and practical community that aims to find the best ways to help others and put them into practice. As far as I can tell, their purpose is to look for ways of helping that actually work and yield good results, instead of just doing charity to feel better about themselves. That's all for now. Bye. If you wish to support my channel, please click thumbs up, subscribe and share my videos. Any comments on the videos would also be welcome.